And an apparent murder-suicide took place Sunday morning, sending shockwaves through the city. Alexandria police say at around 4:30 a.m. they responded to a domestic disturbance in the 5900 block of Ronmar Drive. Two bodies were discovered upon arrival: 38-year-old Shanterrica Smith and 42-year-old Tracy Johnson.
Authorities say it appears that both died from gunshot wounds, but that Johnson's appeared to be self-inflicted. They are investigating this incident as an apparent murder-suicide. APD asked anyone with information about this incident to contact them at the number on your screen.
What's your emergency? Panicked voices spill through the line. Words tangle over each other. Fear, confusion, disbelief. A neighbor gasps for air between sentences, trying to explain the unthinkable. I heard it. It sounded like gunshots. Please, someone come quick. They're in there. I think somebody's hurt bad. In a quiet corner of Alexandria, Louisiana, where neighbors exchanged holiday cards and children played just a few houses down, a tragedy erupted without warning. How does love, something meant to build, protect, and nurture, become a weapon? What leads someone who once swore devotion to cross a line that can never be uncrossed? Tonight, we follow the path of Shanterrica Smith, a woman with a heart full of ambition, dreams bigger than the world around her, and a future that sparkled just within reach. And Tracy Johnson, the man who once held her hand, and in the final moments, held her fate.
After a long day's work, now I'm waiting on my missus, waiting on my wife, waiting on my best friend, waiting on my lifetime partner to sit there and walk through the door after her long day at work, you know. And I just want to surprise her with one of her little favorite meals that she liked for me to sit there and cook.
A love that promised a lifetime, ending in a moment that stole everything. But what really happened inside those walls that night? Was it jealousy, rage, fear, or something no one could have ever imagined? Stay with us, because what you're about to hear isn't just another story about loss. It's about the hidden storms that gather behind closed doors, long before anyone notices the first crack in the foundation. Before we continue, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you crave real stories that matter, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your voice helps keep these stories alive. Now, back to Alexandria, back to that night when everything changed forever. Shanterrica Smith was born and raised in Alexandria, Louisiana, a place where everyone knew everyone, and families, though sometimes struggling, leaned on each other to get by. Her world wasn't glamorous. In fact, for Shanterrica, life often felt like a constant uphill battle. Yet, despite the financial strain that held many back in this small town, there was always an abundance of love, community, and resilience in her home. Her childhood was colored by the presence of her family, a tight-knit group who shared the same dreams of making something more of their lives. They weren't rich by any means. Money came and went in waves, and there was always something that needed to be paid. But what they lacked in wealth, they made up for in spirit. Shanterrica's mother, a hard-working woman who balanced multiple jobs, worked tirelessly to provide. And Shanterrica, though young, was inspired by the sacrifices she saw. From an early age, she understood the weight of struggle, but more importantly, she also understood that the fight for a better life was worth every ounce of effort. Shanterrica grew up to be vibrant, a young woman whose laughter and presence could light up a room. Her energy was infectious. She had big dreams and an even bigger heart. But those dreams weren't just about herself. Shanterrica's true love was for her family, and later for her son. Her son, her pride, her joy. He was the center of her world. Everything she did was for him. From the moment he was born, Shanterrica's life had a singular purpose: to give him everything she hadn't had. Stability, opportunity, a future without the struggles she had known growing up. But life wasn't always easy. While others her age might have been out partying or taking time to figure out who they were, Shanterrica was working. She juggled multiple jobs, waiting tables, working in retail, doing whatever she could to bring home enough to keep her son's future bright. She fought for every paycheck, made sacrifices, and worked late into the night, only to rise the next morning to do it all over again. But through it all, she kept that smile, that infectious energy. The kind of warmth that made others feel like everything would be okay, even when it wasn't. Shanterrica dreamed of more. She dreamed of a life where she didn't have to worry about how the bills would be paid, where she didn't have to work herself into exhaustion just to scrape by. She wanted a better future for herself, her son, and anyone she could help along the way. She wanted a life full of love, real love, stability, peace. But for all her dreams, her search for a better life would, tragically, lead her into a dangerous web of love and control, one that would ultimately end her life. As Shanterrica navigated her journey through the struggles and joys of life, she found herself in a relationship with someone who appeared to offer everything she was searching for: affection, support, and the promise of a future together. But as we'll come to learn, things weren't always what they seemed. Shanterrica's search for love and stability, something so basic, something so natural, would ultimately take her to a place no one could have anticipated. It was a story that many would recognize. A chance meeting, the chemistry, the spark. Shanterrica Smith, ambitious and hardworking, had finally met someone who seemed to understand her, who saw her worth. His name was Tracy Johnson, and to Shanterrica, he seemed like everything she had been searching for, the perfect partner. It wasn't long before Tracy's charismatic nature pulled her in. He was a man who could command a room with his smile, a voice that could calm any storm. When they met, Shanterrica was at a point in her life where she was searching for stability, for someone who could match her ambition and drive. Tracy, with his sweet words and promises, offered exactly that. He told her he wanted to build something real, a future full of love and security. For Shanterrica, it was everything she had been longing for. Their relationship moved quickly, like a whirlwind. There were late-night phone calls, moments of laughter that felt endless, and promises of a future where all of their dreams would come true. Tracy became more than just a boyfriend to Shanterrica. He quickly slipped into the role of protector. He was everything she needed, or so it seemed. He was the kind of partner who made her feel like she didn't have to fight for her place in the world anymore. In Tracy's presence, Shanterrica felt safe. Safe from the worries of everyday life. Safe from the exhaustion of having to do it all on her own. And for someone who had been through so much, the idea of finally having someone there to stand beside her was nothing short of a dream come true. But as with many stories that seemed too good to be true, cracks began to form in the shiny exterior. It started small, almost unnoticeable at first. Tracy's words, while sweet, began to carry a weight that Shanterrica hadn't expected. He would call her multiple times a day, to check in, to make sure she was where she said she was. At first, it felt like a sign of affection. But then the calls became more frequent, the questions more pointed. Where was she? Who was she with? Was she really working late, or was she doing something else? As time passed, the controlling behavior, though still veiled under the guise of concern, became more apparent. He would question her about male friends or anyone she spoke to for too long. He would get upset over small things, like a casual conversation with someone else or a late night out with friends. Tracy began to make Shanterrica feel guilty for things that didn't seem wrong. And while the early part of their relationship had been filled with promises of love and partnership, this new dynamic felt less like protection and more like restriction. At first, Shanterrica brushed off the strange feelings that began to creep in. After all, Tracy loved her, right? He wanted the best for her, didn't he? But slowly, those feelings of doubt began to grow, as did the tension in their relationship. Friends and family who had initially supported the romance started to notice the changes. They saw Tracy's possessiveness, the way he kept Shanterrica close, not in a loving embrace, but in a grip that felt more like control. It wasn't just the calls, the questions, or the accusations. Tracy's behavior started to take on a darker edge. He would get upset over small things. Friends who had been close to Shanterrica noticed that she seemed more withdrawn, more anxious, whenever Tracy was around. Her usual bright, carefree nature was slipping away, replaced by someone constantly trying to please. Someone trying to avoid making Tracy angry, even over trivial matters. Shanterrica's family began to voice their concerns. Her mother, who had always been a steady source of support, began to ask questions. Does he really treat you well? her mother would ask, sensing the tension that had begun to settle in her daughter's life. But Shanterrica, caught between her love for Tracy and the confusing signs she was seeing, dismissed the concerns. "He's just protective," she would say. "He cares about me." Her friends also started noticing things. The quiet moments when Shanterrica would speak less, the way Tracy seemed to always be the one to call the shots. And though they tried to warn her, Shanterrica, in her heart, still believed in the promises he had made. After all, Tracy was her protector, the man who would give her everything she ever wanted. But for those closest to her, the early signs were clear. Tracy's love was beginning to feel less like protection and more like possession. At first, the cracks in Tracy's charming facade were small. So small, in fact, that Shanterrica could almost convince herself that it was nothing. After all, when you're deeply in love with someone, it's easy to overlook the early signs, the things that don't quite sit right. But slowly, as the days turned into months, the emotional manipulation began to escalate. Tracy's behavior wasn't just about being protective anymore. It had become controlling. His once adoring gaze began to carry an edge, a silent pressure that weighed down on Shanterrica, one she could never shake off. He became obsessed with her every move, with where she went, who she spoke to, and how long she stayed out. These weren't questions asked out of concern. They were accusations dressed up as care. It started with subtle hints. Tracy would say things like, "You're not really one of those girls who goes out late, right?" Or, "I thought you were going to stay in tonight. Why didn't you tell me you were leaving?" The pressure to explain herself grew, until one day it wasn't enough just to answer. He wanted full access to her phone, her social media, and even her conversations. It wasn't long before Tracy's manipulative tendencies moved beyond the verbal to something more isolating. Slowly, he began to drive a wedge between Shanterrica and the people who cared about her. At first, it was just small comments. "They don't understand us. They don't want to see us happy." Then, it grew more intense. Tracy would criticize her friends, telling her they were bad influences or questioning their loyalty. He would whisper doubts into her ear, questioning why they even bothered with her when she had him. It was classic isolation, a tactic often used by abusers to gain more control. Shanterrica began to spend less time with her family and friends, not because she wanted to, but because Tracy convinced her that they didn't have her best interests at heart. She missed birthdays, family gatherings, even some of her closest friends' milestones. She stopped confiding in people who once knew her best. Every time she tried to talk about Tracy's behavior, she was made to feel like she was overreacting. "You know, I just want to take care of you," he would say, his voice soft, as though trying to soothe her fears. But behind those words, a darker intent was brewing. The arguments grew more frequent, and the accusations more outrageous. Without any evidence, Tracy began accusing Shanterrica of infidelity. He would claim to have seen her talking to other men, even when she hadn't. He would question her about her whereabouts, demand to know who she had been with, and insist on knowing the smallest details of her day-to-day life. Every answer she gave seemed to spark even more accusations. "Why didn't you tell me about him? What were you doing there? Were you meeting someone else?" He twisted every moment into a moment of distrust. But Shanterrica began to feel the weight of it all. She started to question herself, her sanity. She had never experienced this kind of manipulation before, the slow, insidious kind that made her doubt her every decision, her every word. In her private moments when Tracy wasn't around, Shanterrica's doubts started to grow. She tried to express her concerns in subtle ways, to herself and to those few she trusted, through text messages to friends, in conversations where her voice shook with uncertainty. Text message, "I'm really starting to feel like he's always watching me, like I can't breathe without him questioning it." Another text read, "I don't know how much longer I can do this. He's accusing me of cheating, and I haven't done anything wrong." Her friends could sense the shift in her, the way she was no longer the same carefree woman they once knew. They tried to reach out, but each time she would pull away, unable to fully see what was happening. Tracy's grip on her was tightening, and the self-doubt he planted in her was taking root. It was all becoming harder to ignore. But the most dangerous part of Tracy's control wasn't just the accusations or the jealousy. It was the subtle manipulation. the emotional blackmail. Tracy would flip from anger to charm, from suspicion to reassurance. He would apologize, tell her how much he loved her, and promise to change. And each time Shanterrica would forgive him, believing the promises that seemed so genuine at the time. But deep down, a part of her knew something wasn't right. The love she had once felt for him, the man who seemed to be her protector, was now clouded with confusion and fear. The relationship was unraveling, and Shanterrica was trapped in a cycle of manipulation that made it harder and harder to break free. Have you or someone you know ever ignored early red flags in a relationship? Share your experience below. Sometimes the smallest signs can be the biggest clues to something far darker. As summer deepened in Alexandria, Louisiana, the warmth of the season did nothing to thaw the growing chill between Shanterrica Johnson and Tracy Johnson. What had once been a romance filled with whispered promises and tender glances had decayed into something volatile and dangerous. Those close to Shanterrica could feel it, the urgency in her voice, the heaviness in her eyes. Something had shifted, and it was no longer just arguments behind closed doors. Tracy's moods swung faster, darker. What used to be petty jealousies were now full-blown confrontations. Their home, once filled with laughter and dreams for the future, had become a pressure cooker, simmering with resentment and fear. In the days leading up to the tragedy, Tracy's behavior became increasingly unstable. Friends recalled how he seemed on edge, irritable over the smallest things. Shanterrica couldn't predict his moods anymore. A simple question could ignite a fury, a harmless text message from a coworker could trigger a tirade. The arguments weren't just private anymore. Neighbors started hearing the raised voices, the slamming of doors. Late at night, echoes of screaming would cut through the still Louisiana air, unsettling those living nearby. Each fight grew more explosive, each reconciliation shorter and more hollow. The cycle of abuse tightened its grip around Shanterrica, suffocating any hope that things could go back to the way they once were. But Shanterrica hadn't given up. Despite the fear creeping into her daily life, she clung to the hope that she could reclaim control, not just of the relationship, but of her future. In quiet moments, away from Tracy's shadow, she made promises to herself. She spoke about saving up for a place of her own, about finding a better job, about creating a safer life for her son. She wasn't naive. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Setting boundaries with an abuser is never safe. It's a risk. And with Tracy's growing paranoia, that risk was increasing by the day. Still, Shanterrica tried. She started insisting on time to herself. She pushed back when Tracy demanded to know her every move. She began to reestablish ties with old friends, sending texts that said, "Miss you, hope to see you soon." Tiny steps, brave steps, dangerous steps. And Tracy noticed. To a man who thrived on control, Shanterrica's growing independence wasn't just a threat. It was an unforgivable betrayal. His anger, once buried under fake apologies and desperate charm, now surfaced with frightening regularity. Witnesses later described how Tracy would show up unannounced wherever Shanterrica was, at work, at the homes of friends, even at her own family's house. He would demand to see her phone, to question her about imagined affairs. No amount of reassurance could calm him. No explanation was enough. It was clear. Tracy Johnson was unraveling. And then came the night that everything collapsed. On a humid evening, as darkness settled over Alexandria, the arguments in Shanterrica and Tracy's home reached a fever pitch. Neighbors recalled hearing them earlier. Raised voices, furniture scraping against floors, something heavy slammed into a wall. At first, it was easy to dismiss. After all, everyone had heard shouting before. This wasn't new. But that night, it was different. The screaming was sharper, desperate. It was the sound of terror, not anger. Shouts for help, cries that sent chills through anyone who heard them. One neighbor, hands trembling, grabbed the phone and called 911. Then another, and another. Calls poured into the emergency line, each one carrying the same frantic urgency. Something terrible is happening. Please, send help. Dispatcher voices worked quickly, sending units racing to the address. By the time the police arrived, the worst had already happened. Inside the home, the dreams Shanterrica had fought so hard to hold on to, the future she had tried so desperately to protect, had been shattered. In one violent, irreversible act, everything was taken. The vibrant young mother who had battled financial hardship, who had worked multiple jobs, who had dreamed of giving her son a better life, was gone. And the man she had once believed would be her protector had become her executioner. The first patrol car pulled up within minutes of the frantic 911 calls. Flashing lights splashed across the quiet Alexandria street, painting homes and trees in bursts of red and blue. But for the officers stepping out of their vehicles, it was clear. Something inside that house was terribly wrong. The door to the home hung slightly ajar, swinging listlessly in the night air. Shouts from law enforcement filled the space. Commands to show hands, demands for surrender. But inside, there was only chaos. The scene was brutal. Shanterrica Johnson lay on the floor, gravely wounded, the life already draining from her. Blood stained the floorboards beneath her. Her breathing was shallow, labored, every faint gasp a heartbreaking fight against the inevitable. Officers rushed to her side, immediately calling for paramedics, their voices tense, urgent. They attempted CPR, applied pressure to her wounds, desperate to save the young mother whose dreams had been so violently ripped away. Time seemed to collapse in on itself, seconds dragging like hours as they fought to pull her back from the edge. But it was too late. By the time medical personnel arrived and took over, the final flicker of life in Shanterrica had faded. Her body lay still, gone, in the very place she should have felt safest. While officers tried to process the horror of what they were witnessing, Tracy Johnson stood nearby. Witnesses, officers who were present that night, described his demeanor as blank. No frantic explanations, no pleas, no tears. He didn't run, he didn't scream. He simply stood there, emotionless, detached, as if the gravity of what he had done hadn't even registered. When officers placed him under arrest, Tracy offered no resistance. His hands were cuffed behind his back, his face devoid of expression. He didn't ask about Shanterrica. He didn't ask about what would happen next. He said almost nothing at all. The same man who had once vowed to love and protect her had instead delivered the ultimate betrayal. And now, the consequences were irreversible. But the devastation didn't end with Shanterrica's death. There was someone else caught in the wreckage of that night. Someone far too young to understand the full weight of what had been stolen from him. Their son, a little boy who had once clung to his mother's hand, who had been the reason behind her every sacrifice, every late-night shift, every dream of a better tomorrow. In an instant, he had lost the most important person in his world. The one who had nurtured him, shielded him, loved him unconditionally. And though he was physically unharmed, the scars left by that night would last a lifetime. A child who should have been tucked safely in bed, dreaming of school, of birthday parties, of ordinary joys, instead woke up to a world forever changed. A world where the safe arms of his mother were gone. Family members rushed to rally around the boy, struggling to make sense of the unthinkable. To find the words to explain what no child should ever have to hear. To carry forward Shanterrica's love and legacy, even as their own hearts shattered in the process. The community of Alexandria, too, felt the aftershocks of that night. People who knew Shanterrica, co-workers, neighbors, friends, mourned the loss of a bright spirit extinguished far too soon. At her memorial, people spoke of her laugh, her kindness, her fierce determination to create a better life for her son. Tears flowed freely, not just for what was lost, but for what could have been. The milestones she would never see, the dreams she would never fulfill, the boy she would never again tuck in at night. And as Tracy Johnson sat behind bars awaiting the slow churn of justice, the larger questions hung heavily in the air. How could love turn into such devastating violence? How many signs had been missed? How could something like this happen to someone like Shanterrica? A week after Shanterrica Johnson's life was violently taken, the city of Alexandria came together to honor her. At the small church where she had once sat proudly beside her son during Sunday service, now a sea of mourners filled every pew. Friends, neighbors, co-workers, even those who had only known her in passing, came to pay their respects. Photographs of Shanterrica lined the front of the church. In each frame, her smile shone brightly, a reminder of the light that once radiated so effortlessly from her. As the service began, her family struggled through tears to share memories. Her mother spoke of a daughter who was determined, resilient, full of dreams. A sister recalled Shanterrica's infectious laugh, the way she could lift spirits even on the hardest days. Community leaders stood at the podium, their voices trembling with emotion, speaking about a loss that extended far beyond a single family. They spoke about the plague of domestic violence, a crisis too often hidden behind closed doors, only coming into full view when it was already too late. One community advocate said it plainly: "We lost Shanterrica not just to one man's violence, but to a silence that still lingers in too many homes. We have to do better." Candles were lit outside the church after the service. Names were read aloud, not just Shanterrica's, but other victims of intimate partner violence in the region. Each flame represented a life cut short, each flicker a promise to never forget. Shanterrica's son was there too, small, confused, clutching the hand of a relative. He didn't fully understand yet why his mother couldn't come home. But he would grow up knowing the town remembered her, that her life and her death had not been forgotten. Across Alexandria, conversations began to change. Schools, churches, and local organizations started hosting forums. Workshops on recognizing early signs of abuse were organized. Helplines were advertised more visibly. People who might have once kept silent started speaking up. The tragedy sparked movement, but it came at a heartbreaking cost. And yet, as heartbreaking as it was, a question hung heavily in the air. Could this tragedy have been prevented? The story wasn't over yet. When we look back at Shanterrica Johnson's story, the pain of her loss is undeniable. But her story is not just a tragedy. It's a call to action, a reminder that silent suffering can only end when we learn to recognize it and refuse to ignore it. Across countless homes, relationships begin with promises of safety and love. But real danger often doesn't announce itself loudly. It creeps in quietly, through moments that might seem small at first, but grow into patterns that are impossible to ignore. Jealousy that isn't about love, but about control. Isolation that isn't about intimacy, but about power. Constant accusations, emotional manipulation, silent treatments, explosive anger over imagined betrayals. These are not just bad moments or rough patches. They are early warning signs, the very ones that Shanterrica's friends and family noticed as Tracy Johnson's mask began to slip. Too often, victims are made to feel like they're overreacting, that it's not that bad, that they're responsible for fixing the relationship, even if they are the ones being broken by it. But the truth is simple, and it's something every one of us must remember. Real love builds you up. It doesn't break you down. If you're seeing these signs in your own relationship, or in the life of someone you care about, know this: you are not overreacting, you are not being disloyal by speaking up, and you are not alone. Intervention can save lives. It's uncomfortable to ask hard questions, it's painful to confront difficult realities. But silence is far more dangerous. Family members, friends, neighbors, all have a role to play. If something feels wrong, it probably is. A kind word, an offer of a safe place to stay, a reminder that there is help. It can mean the difference between life and death. There are resources available for those trapped in the cycle of abuse. The National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-SAFE 7233, available 24/7. Local shelters and advocacy centers offering safe housing and support services. Counseling services, not just for survivors, but for families healing from the trauma domestic violence leaves behind. And for every survivor watching this, your story isn't over. You deserve safety. You deserve peace. You deserve a future free from fear. Maybe you can't change the past. Maybe you can't undo the hurt that's been done. But together, by speaking out, by supporting survivors, by never ignoring the signs again, we can change what happens next. Shanterrica's story ended in heartbreak, but her memory can fuel something powerful. A world where no one has to suffer silently, trapped by someone who claims to love them. If you believe in spreading awareness to stop domestic violence, please like, share, and subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles. Your support could save lives, and somewhere out there someone may hear this message and find the strength to walk away before it's too late. Because every life deserves protection, every voice deserves to be heard, and every love story deserves to be safe.